Judith Lorella and I put together this proposal for the seminar series because we were aware of work on the philosophy of poverty, on philosophical issues associated with childhood, and substantial work on philosophy of education. But we were also aware that there was very little work that put these three bodies of ideas together and tried to draw out tried to put some of the conceptual clarity from philosophical analysis to work on this extensive and important terrain of understanding poverty, education, and childhood. We did this in 2019, 2020 in 2019. And at the time, we were each from our own work aware of how, that this was an important area to work on. But it was before the COVID crisis made this an absolutely central area of global and national, and in every area of the world, local concern. So we feel these discussions are very timely, and I'll circle back to some key issues I think the COVID crisis has raised in commenting on the two previous seminars. 2 days ago in the UK, it was the anniversary of the first lockdown, and there was a lot of reflection nationally and in the press about what had been learned, what had been experienced. And the British Academy released a report on the kind of social impacts of COVID, put together by Dominic Abrams and a team. And one of the key, they talk in that report about a COVID decade and the profound effects of this experience. And one of the organizing ideas that I found very interesting in that report, which I think is kind of germane to our discussion about poverty and childhood, is they talk about place, space, and place, scale, and time, all of which have been impacted or have had effects on the way the epidemic has heightened inequalities. And I think those themes of place, scale, and time have also come through our two previous seminars. The first seminar, which was a round table with two philosophical papers and two sociological papers, I think drew out the issue that I kind of can't quite find the verb, but it was something about the need to translate or navigate between ideal and non-ideal circumstances in relation to thinking about education and poverty, that the multidimensionality of both makes this a particularly complex area. And in that British Academy paper, they talk about scale. So if you think about time and place, seem to be particularly fixed for children in poverty, both place and time. And school as a space to navigate the scale of those relationships doesn't seem, unless we're highly astute in thinking about it, to respond to overcoming those fixities of time and place. So I think that tension about the way in which education is delivering for the poorest children isn't just an issue about policy not being implemented well. It's associated with particular kinds of concepts and with the kinds of claims for education that are made to address poverty, but are not astute, but the education itself is not astute enough to the nature of the experiences of poverty. And the complexity of those experiences came out in the second seminar, which were presenters from 4 practitioners, one a UN leader of a large UN project working with teachers, 2 people from a large international NGO working in Mozambique, and one paper from a presentation from a head teacher in a London school, and one from an activist working on education and poverty in the UK. And I think what came through to me from those presentations was that education and poverty invoke so many relationships. There's this kind of complex interplay of history, of relationships of colonialism and difficulties of decoloniality, the economic processes associated with school finance, teachers' pay, families' resources, and the costs of schooling, which are so much more than just what might be narrowly interpreted. And there are all kinds of issues in play about the school as a welfare hub, a site of psychosocial support, and the importance of breaking the silences around poverty. So I think you can see that we've got a very rich array of ideas to play with. And what we're going to dig down into in this seminar is some of the justice issues associated with disadvantage. So it's now a great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Sridhar Venkatapuran. Sridhar is Associate Professor in Global Health and Philosophy and Director of the Global Health Education and Training at the Global Health Institute at King's College London. He's written widely on health justice issues, and he's really been an active advisor and to some key political figures, and really trenchant commentator on the COVID crisis. And it's wonderful to have Sridhar here to talk on this theme. The topic of his presentation is distributing superpowers to the poorest children in the world. So Sridhar.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning and evening, depending on where you are calling from the world. This is a real pleasure for me to be able to join you today, mostly because, as Elaine said, I work on health, and I work on health and have been working on health mostly for a long time, largely because I was born and raised in a developing country of India, and I felt as though health is often one of the most primary concerns of people. And so I felt as though sort of nothing is possible if you're not alive. And so, you know, I just wanted to sort of think about health as being primary stuff. But of course, education is something of, you know, significant importance in lives of people as well. And it's sort of not because I don't think education is important that I've not done work on it. It's just that I just have been sort of involved in health. And so it's been really, especially over the last year, and especially because of this invitation, it's been a really valuable opportunity for me to reflect on education. So what I'd like to do today is that I'd like to ask for your forgiveness in that I don't have a very polished argument ready to give you, because I don't know the educational debate so much. And so I don't really want to sort of try to intervene or do a fake intervention into a non-existent debate. So I'm going to try to do 3 things for you. One is that I want to point you towards a recent article that a friend of mine has written, and I'll tell you a little bit about him and why I think everyone should be reading this article. Second is that I'd like to trace for just a little bit, because of the time that we have, about the similarities and differences between working on health justice versus educational justice. And third, I'd like to talk to you about superpowers and whether justice should be distributing superpowers or not. And so those are the 3 parts of my talk. I hope that's okay with the organizers, and I apologize beforehand if it's sort of off the mark. So firstly, I was greatly aided in my rapid education about issues around justice and global education, or by global, I mean education in low and middle income countries, by my friend Girin Bihadri. So many of you will not know him, but he is, turns out to be a friend of mine that I didn't know that he was very important until it was too late. So basically, Girin is in charge of education at the Gates Foundation. I didn't realize that this was his job or this was his role until very recently. And it also turns out that he has been suffering from a terminal illness, which will not see him through the end of this year. And as a result, he has been reflecting on his work over the last many years, but also really thinking about what he wanted to say to the world. And so he's written an essay which he has published in the International Journal of Education and Development. And I'm going to now click the return so that in your chat, you should be able to get that link. So if you're interested in that, and then there's also a podcast that goes with that as well. And it's, I think, a really worthwhile essay to read because as someone who is going to be exiting the world and also the situation and the problem, he gives a very honest and clear assessment of what he thinks is the problem and what he thinks should be the solution. Many people who are involved in, as we know, who are involved in politics and problems don't really want to tell you what the real problem is because then they have to deal with what that might cause them. So he has nothing to lose at this point. And so he essentially names the situation as a global collective failure in education. And this is not a man who goes for euphemistic language usually. So this is sort of something that he's sort of arguing that this is something that we really need to pay attention to, which is that he says, you know, basically, according to the data, 9 out of 10 children in low-income countries are not literate. However, because of the Millennium Development Goals, et cetera, we have millions of people who are actually present at school. The fact is that so millions of people have been told, because the indicators measure how many children are present at school. And so all these kids are in school, but they're actually not learning anything and they're not literate. And so then he sort of traces what the failures have been as a result or what have caused the situation through the decades of different kinds of agendas. And his basic argument is this, is that he makes a sort of term which he calls foundational literacy and numeracy. And I will take this up as a philosophical issue later on. But basically, he's arguing for some idea of core foundational literacy and numeracy as being what he thinks that that the world should focus on. And there's so many disagreements, there's so many actors, there's so many institutions. And he says, fine, let them do whatever they want. But of the people that do care and want to do this, and of the governments that do care, he says most governments actually don't care about sort of foundational numeracy and literacy, but some do. So if you can find those governments and then you can find those supporters, then what you do is that you focus everything that you possibly can on trying to raise that sort of foundational numeracy and literacy in those contexts and those countries. And hopefully this will prove to be some sort of inspiration for everybody else in order to be able to move towards that. So it's very much a practical policy paper on here's the problem, here's why we're there, here's what the solution is, and here's what I think people should do. And he sort of outlines to various different actors what they should do. So what I was looking for is the, you know, why would a philosopher find this interesting, or what's the philosophical issue around this stuff? And a couple of things came to mind. One is that essentially he argues, and a lot of people as well, and so he makes, you know, he provides a lot of references, that if you actually look at the countries that have significantly improved what he would call foundational literacy and numeracy, countries like Vietnam, Cuba, China, who went from a period of a high illiteracy and in numeracy to something, he argues that there was a particular kind of ethos, which he calls egalitarian. And so the idea is that what he thinks is egalitarian is that every child should be numerate and literate, versus sort of a competing view, which is this idea of selective system, which says we will provide all these things, and then whichever child survives and sort of does well, we will celebrate their achievements. And that's the kind of way of doing it. So obviously there's going to be lots of different in the middle kind of places, but the argument is that the system that's egalitarian, where you make sure that every child is literate and numerate, tends to have much overall literacy and numeracy, as opposed to a system that rewards and celebrates achievement of individuals through a system, has a different kind of way. So this to me brought up sort of really interesting questions around what's the egalitarian, what's the ethos? Because I think most liberal democracies in the world would say, well, we're an egalitarian society. What are you talking about? This is what we do. And so there is here then a real definitional problem of what egalitarianism means, and what the kinds of system that we are talking about. So maybe what he meant by egalitarianism is something else, and I'm going to pick up on what he might be meaning about something else. So I would encourage you all to, because you're in this world and this is the world that you're either in or will be entering in, I would really ask you to look at this, because it's also a very macro view of sort of the global system as well. So the second part that I'd like to do is try to trace for you what the similarities between health and education is. So one is that for me, one of the kind of most basic problems is that most societies do not understand the concept of health, or do not appreciate or recognize moral claims that individuals have to health. So a lot of countries, particularly say the United States, think that the conversation is about a right to health care. And I think many of you who are working in education would also have this kind of similar kind of problem, is that most people don't understand what the actual object is that you are concerned about. So is it that you want people to have a right to the textbook, as Lorella clearly has sort of pointed out, or is it to a process, or is it to the outcome, or is it to this capability? So there's actually, I think, very much for me anyway, seems to be a similar kind of problem, is that you might have, for in the United States, they spend $3 trillion every year on healthcare, but they're far from being the healthiest population in the world. In fact, it's one of the worst and the greatest inequalities in health outcomes, despite spending $3 trillion per year. So in a similar way, you might want to say, well, what is actually the object of our concern here in education? And what are we doing in terms of how much money are we spending in this space? And what exactly is it that we're measuring? What exactly do we want to be measuring? What are the different kinds of stuff? So that's one kind of concern, is that just philosophically, the conceptual clarity on the object of concern or moral concern here. And the second thing is that you have to worry about this idea of a right to. And so what are the different ways that you can get to a right to education, or the capability to be sort of reason, or to learn, or to have foundational numeracy and literacy as well. And that's the reason why I work in the capabilities approach, is that it provides the theoretical architecture, which I find defensible, about why people have these basic moral claims to capabilities such as health or education. So, but I think that that's one similarity. The second similarity is that there seems to be that most of the conceptual architecture between both in health and education is fixated on a particular space. And this is to Elaine's sort of introduction as well, which is that in health, a lot of people are fixated on the clinic and the hospital as the space in which health justice happens. And I think a lot of people in education are also fixated on the classroom as being the space in which educational justice happens. But actually, from my work and from lots of people's work over the last 2-3 decades, we know that health actually happens outside of the clinic. So health happens in terms of all the conditions that you are born into and how you're raised and what's going on locally and in your community. And that sort of notion of sort of the clinic as being the space of health justice is actually not correct. It's inaccurate both in terms of the causal relationships, but also inaccurate in that we focus so much attention on that we're ignoring so many other ethical dimensions to the fact that other stuff. So for example, there is one district in Brazil, which I can't really, I don't remember, but sort of Guerin talks about it and lots of other educational research talk about it as well, is that basically two brothers who've been, and a family that's been essentially running the politics for generations or something, but they've come to the point where the brothers take turns running the city. But one of the things that they did was they said, we're going to make sure that every child is numerate and literate. But one of the things that they did to ensure that is that every child is fed, right? So there's always going to be that all the children are fed well so that they're able to learn at school. So that seems to be an understanding that if you want the actual child to learn, it's not the classroom that's the only space of intervention. It's actually everywhere else that that also needs to be sort of focused on. So there seems to be much more here, and I don't know, as I said, my apologies, I don't know the literature in this idea of educational justice, but a significant amount of stuff needs to happen in terms of not just the space of the classroom, but actually what's happening from the local to the global that's impacting that person's, that child, that individual's ability to learn and to acquire various kinds of skills that we would call education. The third, I think, problem that I'm going to focus on, and that I think there's many, many similarities and differences, but there seems to be very clearly a global dimension to this. And I think that a year ago or a year and a half ago, I would have to make a long argument. But I think that all of you should instantaneously understand when I say health is global, I don't have to explain this to you anymore, is that the causes of threats to health are global. Is that some social phenomenon on the other side of the world, whether it was neglect of policy or whether it was a particular action, has set about a chain of causation that's now impacted our health, your health, on a very immediate and local level. And there's been a sort of wall of different kinds of chains of reaction. So it's been a natural experiment where, sort of this virus travels through airplanes across the world. And then when it reaches a country, the kind of social, political and economic conditions within the country differentiate countries in how it spreads within the countries and how many people die, et cetera. So I don't know how many people have actually done this relationship about different kinds of international, transnational factors that impact educational achievements and educational potential, educational opportunities within countries and communities. I would think that it's a similar kind of story. So one example when it comes to children and child health is that in Brazil, there's a high incidence of cavities among children, but very few dentists, right? So many of you who've had dental problems know how excruciatingly painful cavities are, and there's no sort of dentist. The reason is because they can drink Coca-Cola much easier than they can drink clean water. And the reason why that is because the trade regulations do not allow the restriction of high caloric, high sort of sugar beverages and foods into the country, but they also don't provide clean water and education. So there's lots of international factors that are actually impacting very local health and well-being problems. And I would imagine that if one did that kind of political economy of education, you would find a similar kind of transnational stuff. So what does this mean when I'm talking about philosophy is that we have a global justice problem. I see a global health justice problem when I see kids who have cavities in Brazil, but I would think that that many of you should see a global justice problem when you see children who are unable to learn as a result of very big transnational injustice or unfair international systems and rules that are present. So let me then sort of talk to you about superpowers. So if you are with me so far, where I argue that education and health seem to be very similar, and in fact, I didn't say it, but I want to say it now, is that health and early childhood health is one of the most significant factors in life opportunities. And this is also very true of what Giran talks about, foundational literacy and numeracy as well. So what happens to you between the 9 months that you are in your mother's womb, as well as what happens between 0 and 2 years, fundamentally determine what happens to you in your life. And this is not an overstatement. And this is, I think, also significant interest for social policymakers, particularly people who think beyond one political career of 5 or 10 years to thinking about generations. So for example, Angus Deaton, whose book, The Great Escape, I think, Angus Deaton basically comes from the position that there's always going to be inequality in the world. And we are not going to take away inequality, but one of the ways to reduce social inequality that's unfair and just is to ensure that all children have equal opportunities from 0 to 2, right? And so he sort of uses height of children as a way of showing what their life opportunities and their social conditions have been. And so if you see great differences in height among children, that's actually an indicator of social inequalities. So there's lots of other work that he's done, but I am also, I think, quite in agreement that we do not pay enough attention to the significance of what happens to, sort of children when they're inside the mother, as well as 0 to 2. And if we want social transformation, we really should be focusing on these two things. And I think education, foundational numeracy and literacy, is more about 0 to 6 as opposed to 0 to 2. And this is where Lorella's point about what can the health people teach us is that the social determinants of health, social epidemiologists, particularly at UCL, have been very good at identifying the fact that most children start equally when it comes to their ability to talk and to speak and to understand, and they start off in equal position. However, within a matter of few years, within a matter of 4 to 6 years old, you start to see inequalities that match socioeconomic inequalities. And this has to do with things like early childhood stimulation as to how parents stimulate their children, whether with linguistic sort of stimulation or other kinds, and which child gets the stimulation and which child doesn't. And as you can imagine, the middle classes do really well because they've read all the books, all the videos, and they're sort of hyper stimulating their children and getting their children to speak before anyone else, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see that in the social epidemiology of that. And this has long-term implications for social inequalities and the idea of intergenerational justice and the propagation of it. So what does this have to do with superpowers, and what does this have to do with justice? I think a lot of us, particularly in development, are used to this idea that in development, we always talk about minimal achievements. What's the basic needs? What's the basic stuff that we can give to people? What's the basic minimal things that we should provide people? Because that's, partly a charitable outlook, but partly this idea that justice maybe should be about minimal things. And in the capabilities approach, we're always talking about sufficiency, right? So what is the sufficiency of various kinds of things that justice demands that everybody has? And I think when you think about foundational numeracy and literacy, this sounds like it's a minimal concept. And I think that a lot of people find this very troubling. And so the opposite of this, as some of you, I think, have responded, is this idea of like, who are we to judge what is appropriate for some other culture in terms of educational achievement, but also who are we to determine that children should only have minimal foundational numeracy and literacy? We should allow anybody to achieve anything that they want, and this seems like we're dominating them. So I am not going to answer and address those right now. I mean, if you want to ask those questions, and I can take those up. But what I actually want to point out is what Giran writes, and actually Giran quotes Galileo, and he basically says, this thing that human beings have done above all other things, the idea that the person, whoever it was that created letters on a piece of paper, that can somehow, if you know how to read them, you can talk to people across thousands of years, right? You can talk to people across space and time. You can actually also have the ability to have telepathy because you can now think what another person thinks, all because of these alphabets that somebody has created, all because you can put them together in different ways and incredible things happen. So numeracy and literacy is not minimal, but it's actually a superpower, right? It allows you to travel across the world, across space and time, across generations. And so this actually really, I think for me, kind of is making me think a lot about what actually happens when you deny children that superpower, but you allow other children to have it. Right. And so what is sort of this last year has shown us, and what this sort of vaccine inequity situation has shown to me, is that inequity is a matter of life and death. And what we have seen is that when you do not have foundational numeracy and literacy in children, it's not just a bad situation. What you're allowing is the domination of some people over other people. So that is, I think, something about the injustice of distributing superpowers to the rich and the middle classes, but not distributing it to the poor. So it's actually quite a fundamental and I think an egregious inequality. And I think that it's not just about, oh, so they can earn a living. I think that there's something much more spectacular that you're distributing here, aside from just their ability to count money and make a living. And I think we haven't really thought about the significant sort of inequality and the perpetuation of domination and oppression that comes from allowing certain human beings to be numerate and literate while others are not. So with that, I'm going to end my talk. I hope that I've done my three things, which is that I'd like for you to look at this Giran's essay, because I think it's a really good macro sort of view of all the different kinds of issues, but it might be something that you disagree with. But I think that it would be a good introduction to a global policy issue. Two, I've tried to show you the similarities between health and education, and what are the different ways that we seem to be making the same mistakes in both domains, and how we might be able to clarify it. Three, I think that there is a global justice problem here. I don't know how much that has been done in education. And lastly, four, I really wanted to highlight that minimal standards in development may not be so minimal, actually, which is that numeracy and literacy is not a basic needs approach. It seems to be that this is actually a profound superpower that you're allowing certain human beings to have and others not. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sridhar and Lorella, for two excellent beginnings to the seminar. We're now turning to our third speaker, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Adam Cooper, who's talking to us from Cape Town. We have to just try and keep the envy out of our voices and enjoy the sunshine on your screen, Adam. Adam's a senior researcher at the South African Human Science and Research Council. He works on youth poverty and a range of inequalities, and he's written some absolutely seminal articles that look at the ways in which inequality is and education are part of the landscape of South Africa. So this paper that he's going to present for us, the title is on the screen: Just Knowledge, Economics, Ethics, and Terms of Engagement as Inextricable in Colonial Education, ? I didn't say that right, but over to you, Adam.
It seems like a wonderful thing to get invited to speak about justice and education to a group of philosophers until you actually start thinking about what it is you want to say. And I did what seemed like a good idea at the time, which is to pick 2 papers I've written and one that I respect and try and join the dots between them. I will unpack what that involves, but just in listening to the first 2 speakers, and so much of what I heard resonates with what it is that I'd like to say, in many ways, perhaps in slightly different language. But what strikes me that hasn't come through strongly in this conversation so far, and this is even more hazardous to a group of philosophers, but in approaching the issue of justice, it strikes me that we, in aspiring to justice, have to assume that some kind of injustice has occurred. And in making that assumption, it strikes me as difficult to understand without some kind of attention to history. And I wonder if in thinking about some of these issues, we perhaps have glossed over a little bit about what processes are unjust, whether those are economic processes, whether those are histories of imperialism, and thinking about how that can become part of the conversation, because I think that there's a risk of, you know, in a country like South Africa, we have this wonderful way of creating amnesia, even with our fairly appalling history, of how we bring that into questions around justice and education. So I'd like to start with that remark, and the question of how education can contribute to social justice in a post-colonial society like South Africa. And as I said, these are some preliminary thoughts. It's not a coherent paper, and I fear that it might be 3 separate issues, but I'll do my best to try and show how I feel, without sort of unpacking all of these issues, which I will speak about, something gets lost in thinking about justice. So to add another 3 questions to my initial question, I'd like to ask whether it's possible for educational theory to eradicate inequality and bring about justice while ignoring economic realities. Is it possible to think about educational theory eradicating inequality and bringing justice without a complementary theory of ethics, which I don't think is necessarily the case, even if it's implicit in some notions of inequality? And finally, can we have an educational theory that does these things without some theory of what Nancy Fraser calls parity of participation? And I think in particularly in post-colonial context, the issue of language and who brings what language to the table, particularly in a kind of society that values services and consumerism, the equal footing is very difficult to achieve. So I'd like to, in my very wordy title, I've been thinking about how these 3 different but overlapping issues of economics, ethics, and parity of participation might coalesce in some way, but how they also might be separate. So I've said there that one of the challenges is, I always have this bad angle so that I can't see my own screen, to avoid narrow assumptions about justice that only sort of relate to educational outcomes, whilst ignoring, the challenge is to do both, to concentrate on outcomes, but also not to ignore outcomes, and that the processes that lead to these outcomes are important, which I think is the point that I'd like to make. So the 3 papers that I will speak to fairly briefly, one that I've co-authored, one that I've authored, and one that by a colleague speaks to these 3 issues. So the first one that I authored with Stephanie Alaise and Yael Shalem is called Rupturing or Reinforcing Inequality, the Role of Education in South Africa Today. And that looks particularly at how economists have come to understand education in the South African context. The second paper is by a colleague at Stellenbosch University, Aslam Fatah and colleagues, Can Social Realism Do Social Justice? And it's around what gets included in curricula, and more than what gets included, the logic of why something is included in the curriculum. And so I would like to make some points that, well, underline some points that they make, Lou Zippen, Aslam Fatah, and Mari Brennan, around theories of curriculum that do not incorporate a theory of ethics and what that means in a post-colonial context like South Africa. And finally, the books that came out of my PhD, I'd like to highlight some of the issues around language, particularly young people from marginalized communities and what it means for them to speak in their own language in the classroom and how that gets interpreted in terms of this issue that Nancy Fraser calls parity of participation. And so I suppose in trying to draw these three texts together to some kind of notion of justice, I'm saying that we need to be both wide and narrow, that you can't have a theory of justice without these economic issues, without these ethical issues, without these issues of practices. But at the same time, when the debate is only around all of these things, we lack kind of coherent policy implications for what should we do. So the first paper, which we kind of take aim a little bit at economists in the South African context who become very powerful in policy circles, is called Rupturing or Reinforcing Inequality, the Role of Education Today. And I suppose our central point in the paper is that these economists implicitly use human capital theory to assume that giving children more education is necessarily going to level the playing field economically. They're backed by very powerful groups like the World Bank, whose work is also underpinned by these kinds of theories. And to give you a quote or two from local economists, for example, education plays an important role in determining labor market prospects. Having left school early or having received a low quality education, most children from poor households stand at the back of the job queue. Poverty can perpetuate itself via low educational attainment, creating a vicious cycle that impedes social mobility. Substantially reducing inequality is not unlikely without massive increase in human capital of those presently poor. And I think the point that we make in this paper is not that it's not that this is wrong. The analysis, though, that many of these economists make start from the point of poverty and inequality, then show unequal educational outcomes, and say that the intervention should be, as we've discussed already today, in the classroom, whether it's to do with teacher knowledge, whether it's to do with unions, whether it's to do with resources. And none of it, ironically, from a group of economists, looks at the role of poverty and inequality in the home, in the community, as areas that need to be addressed in order to address these unequal educational outcomes. So in some of the points they're saying that we can't it's very difficult to substantively improve equality of learning without addressing these economic issues. Labor market access is not only structured by level and quality of education, but a host of socio-historical factors. It's interesting that in South Africa, Black university graduates earn less than white young people with a high school diploma. So this idea that learning equals earning is empirically incorrect as well. At the same time, this group of economists that I don't think that we unfairly represent also have produced no real theory of job creation. There is this assumption that if young people get more education, more skills, more qualifications, these jobs will magically appear and that all will be well. But there's no real economic theory about how that happens. So you hear continually concepts like low quality education as a poverty trap. And what we argue in this paper is that poverty is a poverty trap. And that one of the dangers is that this research actually very comprehensively and well, it shows very well how inequalities are related to poverty, but then all of the policy recommendations focus on in-school factors, teacher unionization, content knowledge, pedagogical skills, time on task, and so on. And in conclusion, we say there that to position education as the creator, perpetuator, and ameliorator of the great South African divide between rich and poor is simply asking too much of education. So what I suppose we're saying, and in this seminar on justice, is without a kind of parallel or complementary theory of economics, of inequality itself, education as the kind of great equalizer is very difficult to achieve. To move on to the second paper, which is by colleagues, one at Stellenbosch and two are actually Australian. The question that they ask is, can social realism do social justice? And this is a response to a global movement, you could say, but one that has been very influential in South Africa that argues for bringing knowledge back into the curriculum. Powerful knowledge is going to level the playing fields as well, which this paper argues is not incorrect, but it supports a very thin conception of justice as merely redistributing access to powerful knowledge. Curriculum justice as a matter of epistemology trumping ethics rather than inseparable from ethics. And what that also focuses on is the kind of cognitive aspect of education rather than the ethical aspect, and that these don't necessarily need to be an either or. It can be a both and, but that at times the social realist movement makes out as if the only social justice problem is simply giving children powerful knowledge, whatever that is, and that will level the playing field. So, and yeah, I've asked the question, what does it mean for ethics to be sidelined? In contexts like South Africa, with histories of colonial and apartheid rule, where people have been portrayed as inferior through cultural and racial criteria for hundreds of years, it's simply insufficient to give children powerful knowledge and assume all will be well. The processes through which knowledge is shared, the language, the content, the institutional frameworks, as many of the student movement leaders and others have highlighted in South Africa, matter in educational context, and simply focusing on knowledge in and of itself is a very thin way of addressing issues around social justice. As I said there, the outcomes are important and the process too, not only the outcomes. The authors of the paper then go to speak a bit about how various theoretical and conceptual frameworks might help us to see how scientific knowledge and everyday knowledge can be combined to enrich school learning, but that simply focusing on powerful knowledge or abstract conceptual knowledge produces a very thin classroom situation that often erases some of the cultural and epistemological backgrounds of learners who have existed within histories of oppression for a very long time, and that this might create a context where the school is seen as reinforcing what they already know, that society is unfair and so on. So yeah, and they then start to look at Nancy Fraser's concept of parity of participation and what that means, the institutionalized rules for engagement. And in my final text, that comes out of my own work, I will speak to how that manifests in issues of language, particularly in post-colonial context, where many languages often are on the table at the same time. How am I doing for time? Okay. So in thinking about this issue of parity of participation, and speaking to work that came out of my own PhD, looking at a country like South Africa that has 11 official national languages, what language is used in the classroom is a contentious issue, not least of all because a lot of parents particularly want their children to learn in English because it has certain possibilities. But in thinking about how languages are complex mixtures often, and how they've played out racially and historically, this has a lot of implications for how learners in classrooms are able to assert their identities as well as to learn. So my PhD looked at one neighborhood in one area that was created for people classified as colored under apartheid. I realize that term is offensive in the UK. In South Africa, it designates a certain historically linguistic as well as cultural group of people. It's a contested term, but it's not derogatory. And the language that most of these young people spoke was an informal variety of Afrikaans at home. And I compared how they used their home language in the classroom versus in amongst the hip hop groups that I followed around, as well as at a local radio show that I hosted. And one of the things that was interesting, so this is a quotation from one of the educators. The biggest problem is that learners come with a cultural deficiency, no books at home. The only proper English or Afrikaans they hear is from teachers. Once they have a good command of the language, they can be fine. Another teacher said, you can see by their accents that maybe my values and theirs don't merge because of their background. And I suppose I've included this quotation to underline the fact that the way people use language has ramifications for how they're interpreted as learners, as humans, and ethically as humans. And this has a huge impact on how young people or learners feel valued and validated in the classroom. The learners themselves at this high school said, the words are very high this year. We never hear those kinds of words. Everything is in Afrikaans, but it's a very high Afrikaans, not the Afrikaans that we speak. And that's the Afrikaans that they train us in. It's a language that we ought to speak, but it's not the language that we speak. And as I said, and the point about this variety of Afrikaans that they speak is that it's a mixture of things. Whereas what they taught at school is seen as a pure, historically white version of Afrikaans, and that has a lot of complicated implications for how these young people interpret their schooling. So in conclusion, and I probably should have said this up front, but I've tried to include artworks from young South Africans through this presentation to show some of the sort of cultural aspects of justice and how they get interpreted creatively by young people. But I say there that language ideologies exist in the classroom around what is learned language. In non-standard languages are often seen as inconvenient, particularly in countries like South Africa, Singapore, Indonesia, Cameroon, where people have learned to speak mixtures. These languages become standardized, but they're inevitably linked to race and class, and have implications for how young people interpret their place in the classroom. So to skip some of those, in trying to, and I suppose this is the harder part of my talk, and I might need another year to think more carefully about how these three different texts relate to one another or might be joined. One of the things that I've thought about is that it's not only the outcomes that matter, the processes and the practices and how they're culturally embodied have huge implications for how outcomes manifest. That we need to take these social and economic contexts seriously and in a nuanced way, because they're inextricable from these outcomes, as well as seeing education as some independent realm, as opposed to part of social and economic conditions, is quite naive. I think as well, one of the challenges, particularly, and I work in a government-funded research council where, and I noticed this much more strongly, is that academic work still predominantly takes place in academic disciplines. And often that makes it difficult for some of the interdisciplinary work that we've been speaking about today around health and education, for example. And I think that in a place, well, not like a place like South Africa, I think globally, these kinds of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches are needed. Another point that I haven't made, it also pertains to, and this is also when I think about history, it's around the sort of global and national context. And South Africa, as a democracy that was established in 1994 as a democracy, had a very different sort of implications for education and the role of language, for example, in a global context than might have happened in other contexts at other periods of history. And I think that partly some of our problems is that there's been such an aspiration to produce globally recognized, excellent standards of education that something has been lost in that process, and that the politics and practices of knowledge production have become blurred at some point. So I'll stop there because that was a bit of a mouthful. And yeah, I hope that formed one coherent presentation and wasn't 3 or 4 separate ones. But thank you very much again for having me, and it's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for such a very, very interesting and multi-layered paper with so much to think about. So yes, virtual hands clapping. So let's now turn to our last paper from Tristan McCowan. Tristan McCowan is our colleague at UCL. He's a professor of international education. He's works with me at the Center for Education and International Development. He's written widely on rights, on citizenship. He's leading a large project at the moment on climate justice and higher education. And some of his initial work was in Brazil, looking at social movements and social justice. And the title of his paper is Deschooling and Educational Justice. So Tristan.
Thank you very much, Elaine. It's really great to be part of this panel. I've really enjoyed it. And I did think that my talk might be a little bit left field, but actually I have seen hopefully a few connections with the other papers. So that's great. And I really enjoyed listening to all the other ideas. So my interest in deschooling started around, I suppose, the early noughties when I was starting graduate study, my postgrad degrees, and I came across Ivan Illich's book Deschooling Society, as many people do, and also Judith's book on anarchism and education, which is brilliant, by the way, if you haven't read it. And I got interested in these ideas, and I went along. I can't remember where it was, but it was one of these London-based think tanks had an event on deschooling. I thought, oh, I'll go along. I'll meet up with some like-minded radicals, and it was full of free marketeers in suits looking to develop sort of venture capitalist initiatives so this was my first introduction to the great contradiction that is deschooling, and I suppose libertarian thought generally, is that it's this kind of a circle where the two ends sort of meet rather uncomfortably. What you have now is that the heirs of Illich's ideas, and Illich comes from a left anarchist perspective, are actually the heirs to those ideas are very much on the right, the libertarian right, and what I've called Silicon Valley deschooling, which is mainly in the area of higher education. In fact, my own work is almost completely in higher education now, but hopefully the things that I will say today are relevant also to school level. So it is quite a contradictory field, and I'll try to draw out the implications of deschooling and some of the tendencies that might lead it to support an unjust educational system, as well as what I see some aspects of a just educational system might be for children. But I am ambivalent about Illich's ideas. I suppose to characterize my overall position, I think, firstly, it's quite a difficult book to read. As if you've read Deschooling Society or his other books, he's sort of quite a kind of a whimsical, sort of chaotic thinker. But I think there's a real nugget of insight in there, a very powerful one, which we're not taking seriously and which we should. So this is really not an unqualified defense of Illich's ideas or anybody else's ideas on deschooling. But I think that there is a kernel of that is extremely important and which we're not taking seriously, even though superficially it looks like we are. In the context of the pandemic, lots of education has been going on not in schools, but I'll try and explain how this is definitely not deschooling in the sense that Illich is meaning it, because it still maintains the important characteristics of the school system that he critiqued. And I will explain that a bit later in terms of three elements of gates, roles, and badges, and I'll say a little bit more about how I understand those different elements. Just also by way of a preamble, one thing that's really difficult in debates around deschooling and schooling are to compare like with like, because what you often have is that people present idealized versions of deschooling with real messy versions of schooling, which is obviously unfair. But the alternative as well, idealized versions of schooling with the kind of messy realities of what would actually happen with deschooling in practice. So it's important that we compare what like with like, to have in mind both the sort of potentials, but also the very difficult realities. And you get this often with other things. I mean, you get this in debates of private and public and so forth as well. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And also, even though I'm not going to, I haven't got time to do it today, but also to bear in mind the obvious advantages that schools have in societies of all different varieties. And I think just to highlight some key aspects of that, firstly, in building common citizenship, having a unified schooling system can be, not always, it doesn't always actually fulfill that function. It can be a very important part in creating a cohesive polity that makes democracy possible, in enhancing autonomy of individuals by exposing them to diverse areas of knowledge. So some of our philosopher colleagues at the Institute of Education have led this line of inquiry. In equality of opportunity, so a really important aspect that I'll return to, and particularly for the poor and for other marginalized groups who are in a, this is a point that's been made by others, and low-income families and other groups that have been marginalized from power and influence and resources are less well equipped on the whole to provide non-school educational and learning opportunities for their children because of lack of time, resources, and whatever it might be. And the final point there is the non-educational roles of schools. So schools have a variety of functions relating to childcare, health, nutrition, a whole host of other things that justify their existence, even if they weren't doing any education and learning at all. So all of those things are important. And if schools didn't exist, we would still need to do in some way. So it's important just to bear that in mind when we're considering the arguments towards the arguments for deschooling. So I'll start then. So broadly speaking, the question I'll address is, you know, can deschooling address educational inequality and disadvantage? And I'll start by saying a few things about Illich's ideas on deschooling before highlighting those three features that I mentioned that came out of a paper that I've just written around deschooling relating to higher education, but I think they're relevant to the school level as well. And then I'll end by drawing out some implications for educational inequality and disadvantage more broadly. So Illich through his work, has a broad critique of institutions. And the basic idea, he writes about a whole host of different kinds of institutions, not only education, also health, transport, criminal justice, and so forth. So, and his basic idea is that institutions of modernity may have good intentions and they may be justified when they are set up, but they overstay their welcome. They start to undermine and destroy the very good that they were intended to support. So, you know, schools and hospitals and so forth emerge as ways of promoting health and education and so forth. But over the years, and because of an ossification of the different facets of that institution, actually start to undermine the practice in different ways. And what he argues for instead is convivial technologies rather than dehumanizing ones. And so more spontaneous forms of provision of those goods that have faith in communities' abilities to provide those things for themselves. So deschooling society presents this argument specifically in relation to education. Now, much of the book goes through critiques of school systems that actually are commonplace to most left-leaning critical education commentators, including Marxist ones who are strongly in favor of schools and structures and institutions generally. So I won't spend very much time on those at all. So Illich makes a variety of empirical claims around the ineffectiveness of school systems, and he's looking globally. During his lifetime, he lived in different countries, Europe, United States, Latin America, and so forth, and claims about the ineffectiveness, particularly of schooling systems for the poor. And I think those are, even though his own work is rather shaky empirically, I don't think anyone would doubt those. And Lorella outlines the empirical basis of this at the start of her talk as well. He also makes a critique of commodification of education. Again, it's a very developed area of research and theory. around the hidden curriculum. So for those non-educationists here for whom this might be an esoteric term, the hidden curriculum is this idea that beyond the official curricula that are established for schools, or the implemented or taught curriculum that teachers actually provide in the classrooms, that there is an underlying set of rituals and processes that inculcate certain values deeply in young people who ever go through education institutions that influence their lives. And being generally an argument put forward on the left, they are generally values associated with conformism or support of capitalist economy, such as a competitive individualism, undermining of solidarity, cooperation, and so forth, and conformity to the capitalist system, and to accept one's place in society. So that the idea of, and this is common with the neo-Marxist critique of schooling, that one of the functions that schools has is to make people believe that they deserve their poor lot in life because they had a chance. It's an egalitarian education system. We had a chance to succeed, we failed, so we deserve this this place in the bottom rung of the society's ladder. The next argument is around the problem with qualifications, credentials, diplomas, what Rondeau called the diploma disease, a very catchy phrase, which is actually a very, very good work, Rondeau's work from the 70s, about the deep problems of credentials. Again, this is a critique which is common to many educational commentators, although I think Illich takes it to a rather, he takes it to another level, as it were. I mean, most people working in education are worried about the influences of exams and tests, even people who fully support the mainstream school system. I think it's undeniable that tests can, even though assessments are designed to support learning and to help learners along and to inform teachers in their teaching, that they can have negative influence for a range of different reasons, but mainly through what some people call the backwash effect, that instead of assessment actually gauging what teachers and students set out to learn, they end up defining what they should learn, and in ways that then can impoverish the learning process. And taken to extreme levels, can actually, and this is what Rondeau argued, that they start to corrupt the entirety of society and create a meaningless shell of rituals and institutions that actually hinder and impede meaningful learning. There are two other aspects to Illich's thought that are more distinctive. So one is this idea of a critique of teachers as experts. So this is where he starts to depart from other radical commentators on education. So even Paulo Freire, who was a big critique of school systems, still very much supported the idea of a teacher. So for Illich, we don't need teachers, at least not professional teachers, because Illich was not opposed to people teaching. The problem is that when you start to define a specific group of people as the teachers, and then by virtue of doing that, you define everybody else as not teachers. So Illich's idea is that teaching is important, but teaching is then distributed across anybody who happens to be playing that a role in a particular point in their life. So everybody's moves in and out of the roles of teachers and learnings in different spheres of society, perhaps depending on the topic or at different points in their lives. And the final point is around this idea of a cycle of perpetuation. So, and I find this is a very compelling argument that Illich makes, is that we're prisoners in this system. It's actually extremely hard for us, for anybody, to evaluate the role that schools have in society, because it's almost impossible to step outside. And I'm not talking here about what you might think of as unschooled societies. So communities that don't have the formal schooling of modernity have diverse educational forms, aren't those? But societies that have already bought into the contemporary school system with its whole trappings of qualifications, it's extremely hard to step outside, because the qualifications that the school university system confers on people are almost essential for most forms of valuable opportunity in their lives, most importantly, employment. So there are middle-class families who opt out, but usually they do so in quite a partial way. So you might homeschool, you might go to an alternative school, but usually you hedge your bets by putting your children in to do GCSEs and A-levels anyway, just in case they want to go on and do something conventional. So it's almost impossible to opt out this system. It's a system that perpetuates itself endlessly into the future because of the necessity of the direct credentials provided by schools for other opportunities in society. Alternatives, well, I won't say very much about those, because those it's hard to make a universal stipulation. Illich's ideas that alternatives are created organically by communities and manifest themselves in many different ways, but they adhere to the characteristic of conviviality. So they are collectively constructed through human interactions rather than defined by the dehumanizing technologies of institutions. He put forward ideas of webs of learning, so people can interact on the basis of voluntary associations, which are quite easy to imagine when we come to adults in higher education, perhaps, or other forms of adult education, difficult to imagine when it comes to schooling. And we don't have much to go by in terms of deschooling initiatives for children. There are lots of interesting examples of alternative forms of education for children, but there are rare examples of communities moving from a school to a non-school forms of interaction. And like all of these experiments, it's rather similar to discussions around anarchism generally. You have pockets of alternatives, but it's very hard to judge their success given the fact that they are within a nation or a globe that is operating on an entirely different basis. It makes it very hard for those pockets of experimentation to actually thrive. I'll just say something more about the features of the institution that we're focusing on deschooling and perhaps recreating here before I finish with drawing out some of the implications for inequality. Have I got about 5 or 10 minutes left, Elaine?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. So quite briefly then, we can think of the institution of a school in lots of different ways, and Illich defines it, in quite a commonplace way around sort of age-related, full-time, sort of teacher-led, compulsory education. But in a recent work, I've tried to think about some of the features of institutional education that actually that have important implications in terms of both equality and learning. So I'll just run through these 3 elements very briefly here. So the first of these is gates. And this gates, and of course, accompanied by gatekeepers. So these are the mechanisms that determine who gets in and who doesn't get in to specific institutions, but also to education systems as a whole. So the forms of gates that operate in relation to particular schools are prior academic performance through exams, possibly family background, economic capital, that would be direct selectivity through schools that charge fees. Schools that don't charge fees, there may also be that kind of gate through the need to purchase uniforms and other kinds of materials. So a whole, in some countries it might be postcode, so one's geographical location. So the whole series of gates that determine whether children or adults get into a particular education institution or any at all, and they vary dramatically. So some school systems and some schools have relatively open gates. I don't think any have a completely open gate, but some have relatively open gates, some have very restricted gates. So there's a huge variety. The second is around roles, and these roles are usually particular to the education institution, that when people pass through the gates, they then adopt a specific role that defines their part in the pedagogical process. Most importantly, whether they are a learner or whether they are a teacher, and those roles are fairly fixed in that process. Also, whether they are a manager or decision maker, or some other kind of administrator or learning support. And those roles confer various levels of control over the pedagogical process. And this area has had a lot of attention in educational research. I would say also this connects with another form of gate, which I didn't mention, which is around knowledge. So Adam mentioned the question around knowledge and some of these epistemic questions and language and so forth. And the gates also function to allow in certain forms of knowledge and language and culture from society and keep others out. And the roles then confer the power to frame the pedagogical process in relation to those forms of knowledge, language, and culture. And then the final element here is badges. And this is the term that I use to relate to all the different kinds of validation of knowledge that schools and universities provide. And these, and with all the associated points around diploma disease that I mentioned before, that can stem from very light ones about teaching to the test that was mentioned earlier, to more extreme ones around outright corruption, which is very common in education systems because of the exchange value of education, the positional value of education and its exchange value. Now, all these three elements, I'm not for a moment suggesting that all schools have gates, roles, and badges in the same ways. There's a variety of forms, there's a variety of loci of control and of rigidity of these things. So schools vary a lot in relation to those. But they nevertheless represent significant problems for different areas, which I'll now highlight. So to draw out those implications now, I'll look at three areas of implications of this thesis. The first of which is for inequalities. Now, if we're thinking about inequalities in terms of, well, we can think about it in terms of redistribution. We can think about it in terms of recognition or participation. In terms of the redistributive principle, Illich's argument is on very shaky ground. I think there are strong reasons to think that that schools actually, even though they are usually unsuccessful in achieving this, nevertheless schools are the most promising mechanism that we have for equalizing in terms of a redistributive principle in society. And particularly if we're taking a powerful knowledge perspective on this, that Adam mentioned, the fact that certain skills such as literacy and numeracy mentioned by Sridhar, or certain forms of knowledge, scientific, analytical knowledge and so forth, are crucial for achieving other kinds of outcomes in society and opportunities. Schools are undoubtedly a potentially excellent mechanism for doing that. But the situation looks a little bit different if we look at some of the other principles of equality and justice that we might look at. So Illich goes beyond the relative equality to look at general quality of learning. And I think there are strong arguments to support the fact that schools can have an impoverishing effect on the learning that takes place in other spheres in society, in devaluing it, and particularly because, and this links in with parental preferences around language and schooling, because of the credentials and the validation that's provided to the school-based learning, it places a lesser value in society on other forms of learning, both processes and outcomes that might take place. And the final issue is around epistemic justice. As everyone's aware, this has been a topic that, even though it has a long history of attention in certain spheres, has really come to the mainstream in recent years. And it's, I'd say it's very much the doing of South Africa, in the sense that the Rose Must Fall mobilization captured global attention and led to calls for decolonization all around the world. In fact, there are very long debates and processes around decolonization in Latin America, where I've done quite a lot of work, but they've been sort of ongoing for decades. But the Rose Must Fall movement has really brought this to the forefront. I think it's very important to look at deschooling in relation to decolonization. It may be that we can go so far in decolonizing within the existing institutional structures of schools and universities, in terms of changing reading lists, changing the people who teach in institutions, changing curricular content. But it may be that that takes us to a certain point, but no further. And that if we want a radical form of decolonization, and what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls an ecology of knowledges, or epistemic pluralism, that we have to think of another way of organizing education that doesn't involve this institutional form. And I think this might present the greatest challenge to schooling. And it is a very difficult one. And I think no one is under any illusions that an immediate short-term eradication of school would make things worse for the poor in the short term. But the long-term impacts of deschooling are unknown. And it might be that if we really value educational justice, and we really want to attempt to address the broader inequalities in society, we may have to look at other options. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tristan. That's really thought-provoking and a lot there.